The engines never slept. 9 of them now, distributed across the ridge and the valley floor, each one breathing its steady rhythm into the work that had once broken men by noon. I had watched this town when it was a garrison post, waiting for its own obituary, the veil thinning overhead, the population bleeding away down the southern road, the forges cold more days than not. Give a place power that doesn't get tired, and you find out how much life was only ever held back by how little work a body could do in a day. That was the discovery I hadn't expected. Iron Ridge hadn't been dying, it had been exhausted. The first engine we pointed at a millstone. Wol-yeong had been the one to insist on it, and she had been right in the way she was always right, not by calculation, but by the long memory of someone who had watched too many things go wrong. We were standing in the new mill shed when she said it, the great stone turning with a low, patient rumble, the grain dust hanging gold in the shaft of morning light coming through the vent slats. You know what wins a siege, Do-jin? Not the wall, bread behind the wall. She watched the stone turn. I have watched strong towns with good walls starve because the hands that should have been grinding grain were holding spears. This one stone, turned by fire, grinds for a whole town and frees every one of those hands. You think you built a mill. You built the end of a kind of dying I've watched my whole life. Point the next one at a granary that never empties. I didn't argue. She had been warden of this place when it was a posting nobody wanted, and she had stayed when everyone with options had left. She had earned the right to name what things were for. Mok Jae had been more systematic about it, the way he was systematic about everything since he'd learned to read a drawing. He came to me one morning with a list written in his careful, slightly oversized hand, the handwriting of someone who had taught himself letters as an adult, and still treated each one with a craftsman's deliberateness. Sawmill, drainage pump, the big bellows at the upper forge, the trip hammer, the grindstone, the ore crusher. He had engines on all of it now, and Do Gwang had signed off every boiler before the first fire was lit in any of them. Anything a man does till his back breaks, I want to give to a wheel that can't feel its back, Mok said. He folded the list and tucked it into his apron. The wheel does the breaking work, the man keeps the thinking work. That trade never stops seeming like a miracle to me, and I'm the one bolting them down. He said it without ceremony, the way he said most things, but I heard what was underneath it, the memory of what his own back had felt like before. The road changed. That was the thing I noticed first, in the way an engineer notices the thing that is measurable before the thing that is felt. Foot traffic on the southern road had reversed. For the years I had been here it had moved one direction, out. Families leaving, coffins, sometimes. The particular silence of a place that had given up on itself. Now the carts came in loaded, and the families came with cradles instead of grief, and Wol-yeong stood at the edge of the new housing plots with the expression of someone who had stopped expecting good news and was still adjusting to receiving it. 40 more families this week, she said. I was a warden of a dying garrison, Do-jin. Now I'm quartermaster of a boomtown, and I cannot build houses fast enough. I will never complain about it. She watched a cart come through the gate, a woman on the bench with an infant wrapped against her chest. I spent 20 years watching this road carry people out, in coffins or in flight, watching it carry them in, carrying cradles instead. I'd not trade that for any quiet posting in the empire. Yun Sogin was standing nearby with her record book open, which was where Sogin usually was. She had the look she got when she was about to say something that sounded like a logistics report, but was actually something else. The school's tripled and I've had to train teachers to teach the teachers, she said. Every one of those children will read a gauge and check a truth before they're 10. That's the wall that really holds Wol-yeong, not the iron one, that one. Wol-yeong looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded, once, the way she nodded when she had heard something she intended to remember. I found Cho Yeong in the schoolroom annex one afternoon, standing in the doorway watching the children work. He had his arms folded, and he was very still, which was not how Cho Yeong usually stood. He was watching a small girl, 6 years old maybe, with her hair in 2 tight plaits, who was bent over a workbench with a short rule in her hands, measuring something with the focused seriousness that children bring to tasks they have decided matter. Her hands were unmarked, smooth across the knuckles, no callous ridges, no old cuts healed white. Cho spoke softly, without looking away from her. That one, 6 years old, reading a rule, and her hands aren't scarred yet. A pause. When I was 6, I was sorting tailings till my fingers bled. The engine bought her that, Do-jin. It bought her childhood the time to be a childhood. His voice stayed level, but something in it was doing work to stay that way. That's what all the fire and the danger and Gil, that's what its feo are. So a 6-year-old gets to learn instead of survive. I have to believe that. I needed to be for that. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that would have been the right size for what he just said. I stood with him in the doorway and watched the girl measure, and the afternoon light came through the oiled paper window and lay across the bench in a long, pale rectangle, and she didn't look up. Not everyone received the change the same way. I had known this was coming. I had known it the way you know a calculation is going to produce a number you don't want, not because you can avoid it, but because the arithmetic is what it is. The sawmill had been running for 3 weeks when Pak came to find me. He was an old hand sawer, one of the men who had been working the pit saw since before I arrived, and he came to the yard where I was checking the mill's blade tension with the particular expression of a man who has been deciding what to say for longer than is comfortable. 40 years I spent learning to saw true, he said, F-O-R-T-I, my father's trade and his father's, and your fire wheel does it in 1/10 the time, and now my skill's worth nothing and my boys won't learn it. His voice had the controlled roughness of anger that has been sitting with itself long enough to know it isn't going anywhere. You didn't just build a mill, Smith. You took a thing I was proud of and made it a joke. What am I now? What's any of us with a real trade next to your wheels? Mekteho was at the far end of the yard. He had been checking the blade housing, and he straightened up when he heard Pak's voice. He walked over without hurrying, wiping his hands on his apron, and he looked at Pak with the expression of a man who recognized exactly what he was looking at because he had seen it in a mirror. Aye, he said, quietly, without any defensiveness in it at all. I know exactly what you're feeling, Pak, because I felt it the day a girl ground a surface flatter than my best hammer ever could. Felt the floor go out from under 40 years. Sit down. Let me tell you what I learned next, because it's the only thing that put the floor back. Pak sat. Tae-ho sat across from him on the edge of the lumber stack, forearms on his knees, and spoke to him the way you speak to someone when you're not trying to win an argument. The wheel's got no judgment, Pak. You watched the boiler teach us that in blood. It rips fast and stupid. It needs a man who can read a log to tell it where to bite, when to stop, when the blade's singing wrong. That's you. 40 years of you. The machine didn't make your skill worthless. It made the muscle worthless and left the wisdom standing, and the wisdom was always the part you were really proud of, if you're honest. Come run the saw that took your trade. Nobody else in this valley is fit to. Pak was quiet for a moment. I stepped in before the silence could go the wrong direction. We don't pay men here for how hard their backs work, Pak. We've got wheels for that now. We pay for what's in their hands and their heads. The engine's not your replacement. It's your apprentice. A strong, stupid, tireless apprentice that needs a master. Be its master. He looked at the mill for a long time. Then he looked at his hands, the hands with 40 years of callus and sawdust worked into the creases, and something in his face shifted, not to happiness exactly, but to something that might become it. Doh Gwang had been working on the shipping protocols since before the first daughter engine was created. He came to me with the manifest the morning we loaded the first one for the Eastern settlement, and he went through it item by item with the methodical thoroughness he brought to everything that had a safety consequence, which in his view was everything. Every crate gets the book, he said. Every boiler gets 2 relief valves and a plug that melts before it bursts. And every town that takes one of our engines takes a man I've trained to fear it properly, or it doesn't take the engine at all. He folded the manifest along its crease. I couldn't put it in front of Gil in time, Do-jin. I can put it in front of every other boy on this frontier before they light their first fire. That's the only grave gift I've got worth giving him, a frontier full of engines that remember what we learned the hard way. The fusible plug, the relief valves, the trained man who knew what the pressure gauge meant and what it meant when it stopped meaning it. Gill's lesson, written into iron and copper and the weight of a man's responsibility, shipped out with every engine we made. It was not enough. It was also the most that could be done, and Kwang had done it without being asked. I watched the crate go onto the wagon and said nothing, because there was nothing to add. The problem announced itself the way problems usually do, not as a single failure but as an accumulation of small wrongnesses that eventually resolve into a pattern you can't ignore. The mill was outrunning the wagons, the foundry was outrunning the wagons, the ore crusher was producing faster than the smelter could take the ore, and the smelter was producing faster than the wagons could carry the iron out. In the main yard, meal sacks were stacked under oilcloth in rows that had grown longer every morning for 2 weeks, and Serin had been marking the inventory with the particular precision of someone who was documenting a problem she expected someone else to solve. "We're drowning in our own surplus, Do-jin," she said, standing at the edge of the yard with her record book and the flat voice she used when the numbers were speaking for themselves. "The mill outruns the wagons, the foundry outruns the wagons, everything outruns the wagons. There's meal rotting in our yard, and a town going hungry 40 miles off, and the only thing between them is that an ox walks at the speed an ox walks. We solved making, we have not solved moving, and making without moving just makes a bigger pile." I stood at the edge of the choked yard and looked at it, the stacked sacks, the crated iron, the ore waiting in its bins, all of it sitting still while 40 miles away, people were short of what we had too much of. A tireless heart and an ox's legs. We had taught fire to do the work of 50 men standing still. We had never taught it to carry. I was still looking at the yard when Mok Jae came to stand beside me. He had been quiet for a minute, which with Mok usually meant he was working something out. "Put the engine on the rails." I looked at him. "Don't bolt it to the floor to turn a belt. Bolt it to wheels, on the iron road, and let it pull the load itself." He was looking at the ore cart track that ran from the upper mine down to the smelter yard, the iron rails we had been laying since the early seasons, because rail was slick and true, and an ore cart on iron moved easier than one on mud. The ore carts already roll on rail, because rail's slick and true, a tireless engine that pulls itself, and 100 loaded carts down 40 miles of iron. Teacher, that's not a mill, that's the OX. A tireless ox that never stops and pulls a whole town's surplus at once. I heard it click into place the way a well-fitted joint clicks. Not a new idea so much as two existing things finally being held up next to each other. An iron road. We already made the rails. We already made the engine. We had been making both of them for years, in the same workshops, with the same hands. We had just never put the one on the other and pointed it at the horizon. "That's the next wall," Mok Jae said. "Not making, moving. We're going to teach the fire to carry." That evening I walked to the southern edge of town, where the road ran out between the pine slopes and the darkening sky, and I stood there for a while looking down the valley. The veil overhead was pale and thin, the way it had been for years now. The old magic stretched across the sky like cloth worn to translucency. It still held. It held less than it had. One town, alive, and a dozen more down that road, waiting, some of them with their own failing skies, their own exhausted hands, their own grain that wasn't being ground because the hands that should have been grinding it were doing something else. The old magic had been the thing that tied them together, the thing that made a frontier into a network instead of a scatter of isolated posts. When it went, it would take that with it. We were going to have to build it back. Not with light and inherited power, but with iron and fire, and the logic of a road that ran true between one place and the next, carrying what each place had too much of to the place that needed it. A heart in every town, and an iron road to tie them all together, so no town stood alone when its sky finally tore. That was what the old magic used to be. That was what we were going to have to become. Tomorrow we would start the road.